connection issues here. There may be a slight break in transmission, but you will have me up on your screens soon enough. Welcome to it, guys. It is another episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Again, apologies for that little break in transmission. We seem to have some connection issues lately. I hope that's not going to persist throughout the evening. But if you're joining us, welcome to the show. I'm going to give it a few moments for people to join and hop onto the stream. I'm seeing guys come through. Kerry van Skalkwyk, welcome. Beata Setzer, welcome to the show. Welcome, guys. I'm just going to give it a few moments for people to get onto the stream. I have a humdinger of a show for you guys tonight with a very interesting character, a chap from the Center for Risk Analysis. This is someone who I think you need to actually start hearing a lot more from, especially because I suppose the CRA, the Center for Risk Analysis, is quickly becoming one of the more flagship organizations that provide strategic intelligence to you as an individual, but most importantly, to businesses in this country, whether you're small, a medium, or large enterprise. So look forward to David Ansara, my guest, in about 8 minutes or so here on the stream. As always, we just give it a few moments for people to waft in to the stream. I'm seeing, firstly, thank you so much to you. I nearly read your name in a Zulu way there. I nearly said Osi Romanus. But thank you very much, Cozy Romanus, for your 70 Rand super chat. Super appreciate you, brother. Maybe I should give you that Zulu name. Osi, by the way, in Zulu at least, is something you say at the end of a story, almost like how the English would say once upon a time. Zulus would end the story by saying Osi kwaphela. So Osi, Cozy, thank you so much for that 70 Rand super chat. Guys are coming through here. Molemo, I see you. My brother Khoton Tate. Heather B, I see you. Grant Hockley, welcome to the show. And Johan Neft, welcome to the show, guys. I'm going to give it a moment as I quickly also just say thank you very much to those of you who are donating to the Liberty Bus, donating to the show and to my work, the groundwork that I now spend countless hours a day doing. Today, if I can just give some quick feedback, just for those who are interested. I spent most of today in Delft here in Cape Town, which is I'll call it a township on the outskirts. Actually, I was in Delft and Mfuleni, just on the outskirts of Cape Town, basically beginning the work of, on the one hand, going down the streets, figuring out where and how I will begin my work. And also, beginning to meet people who become zealots for the work that you do on the ground. So it's, as I say, like I have a three-phased approach to how I do the groundwork. It first is reconnaissance, if you will, just knowing the layout of exactly where you'll be when you then start doing what is phase two, which is, meeting and greeting, door-to-doors, leaflet drops, almost like a political party to a large extent, getting to know the people in your neighborhood so that on the third phase, once they are very comfortable with you, they can then invite you into their area and say, look, we're willing to host a Liberty event here. I'll invite 5 of my neighbors. We can sit, we can listen to a short address by me, and I call it an address. I'm being generous. It's more just a Q&A of 5 key ideas that I've condensed into a short message, which then I encourage people, if they're interested, to ask more questions. And that's how you pique people's interest towards liberty ideas, so that people understand there is a world out there outside of the leftist dogma we often hear from our politics and politicians. So that's how I do it, guys. That's basically how I spend my days now. And it's you guys who are donating via Patreon, donating via PayPal, who are allowing me to do things like ever increasingly print out these nice little leaflets that I drop that have my contact details, some of the ideas, and almost a message of, if you want to hear more, contact me, call me, and let me come out to your part of the world. And ever increasingly, I think as my budget grows, I'm going to go full on, almost, as I said, operating like a political party during an election. You might even see posters in your area going up saying, hey man, the BDL show in your area, in a hall. Sorry, I'm really, really thirsty. Excuse me, guys. The BDL show in your area, hosting a little talk, come through, listen to the ideas, and find out whether you hold true, whether these ideas, hold true for you. Can they aid you in your lived experience? The values of faith, flag, family, and freedom, are these the sort of values that you'd want to organize yourselves and your community around? So it's slowly growing, guys. And again, it is you guys who donate to the show, who donate to me, who are making all of this happen. So I'm 100% indebted and thankful, really, to you guys on the show. I'm seeing guys come into the show. Welcome to it. You're watching the Big Daddy Liberty show. In a couple of minutes, I'll have my guest, David Ansara, on the show. As always, can I please spend the next minute or so just doing some basic housekeeping, insofar as thanking those of you who have jumped on the Liberty bus or donating to the show. Some of the more recent faces I'm seeing on here. Let me say a quick thanks to Stephen Lewis, who has pledged a whole $10. Thank you, my brother. I see you for that. $1 from Ethan Keat. I see you, Ethan. Thank you so much. Hannes Verloon, thank you for jumping onto the Liberty bus and supporting. Richard Scott, thank you so much for the support. Tandi, ngiyabonga kakhulu for ungeseka kwindlela yami ngelusa inkululeko namacebo inkululeko kwimphakathi. Thank you very much, Tandi. Ole Selebi, I see you again. Thank you so much, Ole, for the $10. I appreciate you, Ma. And those are the new faces who have jumped on via Patreon. And I know there are some guys who donated via PayPal. Let me just quickly bring the app up so I can just quickly say thank you to you guys on the space. I see you. I see you, WL Leopard. Thank you so much for the very generous donation of $38. I really, really appreciate that. Karen Winter, thank you so much. I see you and thank you for your message. I fully thank you for that. Trust me, it's something which registers on me at a very personal level. And the fact that you place that much trust in my message and my work is very, very highly appreciated. Thank you so much, guys. To all of you who have joined the Liberty Bus, who are contributing your hard-earned rands to the show, thank you so much. I appreciate it. With that being said, let me get into tonight's show. Guys, maybe you are a small business owner. Maybe you have a small business, a small venture, and you've absolutely been decimated by the lockdown. And you're wondering now, as these politicians, continue with their shenanigans, you wonder, where is this all going? What is the outcome? Where, what is in store for you and your business in the near future? And really, what will be the outcomes for you right now, given the shenanigans? So I'm going to have David on the show in a moment. I'm going to take a quick break just to bring him on. And you guys are a part of the show. Calling one, calling all. Please hit the like button. Please share the link of the show. Maybe you have a relative who has a SMME. You do not want to miss the show. We're going to have a humdinger of a show as we look at the political risks that you face for your business. After the short break, my guest, David Ansara, as we unpack exactly that. What are the risks to your business? And you get involved in the show. So pop in your questions and I'll put them to David. Guys, short messages and then I will see you with my guest, David Ansara. All right, guys, welcome back to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Sorry for that little intermission. It was just to establish my guest, as I mentioned before the break, David Ansara, who's the head, the CEO, the head honcho of the Center for Risk Analysis, an organization that I'd really want you guys to do your research in. Their website and their YouTube channel has been linked in the descriptor of this video. Please check them out, especially if you are a, someone who has an SMME, or maybe you're a captain of large industry and you're watching me from your secret covers because you don't want people to know you watch my show. I see you too. Make sure, please, that you go to the Center for Risk Analysis. They really are the go-to when it comes to strategic intelligence and really advice for those of us who are in the business world. David Ansara, I'm going to have on my screen in 3, 2, 1. David, hi, you're on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Welcome, my brother.
Sani Bonani, Ninjani.
There you go, my brother. There you go. I love that. I love hearing the language of the gods being spoken. David Ansara, CEO of the CRA.
Guyabanda Kakulu Namslans in Joburg.
Hey man, let me guess, you took Zulu lessons at school, or that was actually not that bad?
No, well, it's one of, if not the most widely spoken language in South Africa. So you got to learn a few words.
Absolutely. David, welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I'm really excited to have you on the show because, I've been saying for a very long time to my viewers that, I haven't done a show where we provide hard analysis on, the effects of where we are as South Africans right now. There's so much, David, happening and affecting us as individuals, things that really are assaulting our life, our right to life, our liberty, and really our property rights too. And you can almost take that tenfold when it comes to people who are maybe in the business world. Someone who maybe has an SMME and is really worried right now. Let me begin at the top of things, David, just very briefly. The CRA, who are you guys and what makes you guys so special?
So the CRA, Sihle, is a think tank. We're based in Joburg and we focus very much on political and economic risk. So we spend a lot of time researching and analyzing economic policies, so the laws and regulations that govern particularly the business environment in South Africa. And we have a number of clients, so we have all range of premium clients. So we have corporates, financial institutions, foreign embassies based in South Africa. But we also have individuals, ordinary people, typically small business owners, consultants, independent advisors, consultant type people who subscribe to our service. So they get a lot of data on the kind of underlying trends, the main drivers in South Africa. And we always try to situate South Africa, the context within a kind of a global context. So we look a lot at international trends in the United States, in China, in Europe, and so on. And we try to assess.
You are still on, we're still live, I think. There's something very glitchy.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay, there we go. Hi, David. I think we just had a little temporary glitch there, but you are back on live. We sort of left you at, the analysis that you guys provide for business. Yep, sorry.
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time talking to various businesses and other kinds of organizations that operate in South Africa. So we have a really good sense of some of the risks that are associated with this environment. So South Africa is obviously going through a really tough time at the moment with the lockdown still continuing. It's been one of the longest lockdowns in the world. It's been very restrictive of business activities. So everyone knows the restrictions, say, on alcohol and tobacco, which have just been lifted.
Yeah.
But there's been a number of other constraints on commercial activity. So we've been trying to help our clients, many of whom are very desperate, seeing their revenues collapsing. Consumer spending has gone down, so consumer confidence is at its lowest point that it's ever been, if you look at the consumer confidence index. And there's obviously been a lot of consequences for ordinary people. So there was a study, a survey called the CRAM survey, which was a sample size of about 7,000 people. And that showed that, according to their estimates, that pre the lockdown, there were about 17 million people who had a job. After the lockdown, only 14 million people have had a job. So that's a loss of 3 million people. So that is absolutely devastating for those individuals who've lost their livelihoods and their income streams. and also the dignity that comes with having a job.
That's right. I mean, David, there are people behind these numbers. You know, we sometimes forget it, you know, when we're crunching the numbers, and we almost talk in abstracts at times. But David, I think this is why organizations like yours are critically important, you know, in terms of providing for the individual who might be lost, in inverted commas, around what's happening around them now. Greater insight into why politicians make the decisions that they make, and really what the effects of the policy outcomes would be from them. Let me maybe begin here, because I really want you to weigh in on this. You know, you have a small business owner now who might be, you know, upon hearing level 2, has that initial jubilation, right? Because they're thinking, okay, we're going back. Everything's going to be pashash. It might be tough, but everything's going to be pashash. What are the risks that they really should be thinking about? Is it really a possibility? Or rather, should they now not have to pay attention to the diktats and the policy announcements of politicians? Is everything back to normal? Can we just, you know, resume things as they were?
No, unfortunately not, Big Daddy. I mean, I think one of the unfortunate precedents that's been set by the lockdown is this trend of ever greater centralization of state power and control, right? So now that the lockdown is being eased, I mean, there's still a number of restrictions. If you look at the curfew and you know, restrictions on tourism, mass gatherings, etc. But you know, I think the worrying precedent there is that, you know, this entity, the National Coronavirus Command Council, the NCCC, has really superseded the authority of cabinet. Its authority is not really rooted in the rule of law, so it kind of, there's no real precedent for an entity like that. Just bear in mind that the state of disaster, government say there's some kind of natural disaster or an insurrection or something like that, the government could institute a state of emergency and suspend some constitutional rights. The state of disaster doesn't allow that. That's why it has to be renewed on an ongoing basis. But I think that the government's gotten a very strong taste for interfering in business activity, for I mean, if you cast your mind back to some of the rules that were emanating from the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition under Ibrahim Patel, the minister there, saying, you know, you're not allowed to sell open-toe shoes or cook chicken. You know, this shows you, I think, also this desire to try to control outcomes in the economy. Bear in mind that the economy is made up of millions and millions of people freely trading and interacting with each other. And it's impossible for anybody, no matter how intelligent or kind of well-educated they are in terms of policy, to really control outcomes in the way that you desire. Small committees of people are not as effective as those daily economic about their own kind of market behavior. So the worry here is that through various rules, you know, that we might not see certain rules be rolled back. And whilst the coronavirus has certainly been very serious for some people, you know, I think the real risk there has been this growing appetite that the state has for meddling in people's personal liberty, their personal lives as well. So I think that that's a real risk to watch out for, and that's essentially what we do at the Center for Risk Analysis. We help businesses and individuals to try to navigate some of those risks. Absolutely.
And David, let me get into the meat or potatoes, what I really wanted to chat to you about in this episode, because I think even as you're saying this, right, and as we sort of talk about the, and maybe David, let me just take a moment to acknowledge something. Guys, I know there's something wrong with the feed and it might be chopping in and out. I'm not sure what the issue is. So please bear with us. I might switch over at some point. If it really gets bad, I'll take a moment, just a short break, to switch to another Wi-Fi stream that I have. So guys, bear with me, but please do give feedback in the comment section. And whilst you're at it, please send your questions through. If you may be a small business owner, you're part of a big business, send your questions through to David. I will pose them to him. David, as I said, I get back to this. I think you're raising an important point, David, when it comes to the nature of our politicians and the almost unbridled sense of unchecked power that they appropriated for themselves under this National Coronavirus Command Council. Drew, that's quite a mouthful. But we saw a situation, David, where, there was very little pushback in terms of formal accountability. Parliament disappeared for the first few weeks of the lockdown. Big business capitulated very quickly and said, look, we'll do whatever you tell us to do. There wasn't any pushback. Opposition parties, David, didn't even offer anything in the way of pushback or even solid analysis that gave a different viewpoint in the situation. It seemed as if everybody was swimming with the stream that government was telling us to swim in, but you guys had a different take to things. And do you want to maybe quickly talk to me about this, some of the warnings that you guys initially saw with the power being concentrated in the state and the effects that may have on business?
Well, look, Big Daddy, I mean, in the beginning of the pandemic and the crisis, I think there was a lot of uncertainty and limited information. So government had to kind of act given the information that was available. And I think there was a lot of pressure because there was just this kind of a chain reaction or a domino effect of all of these countries going into these hard lockdowns. And that kind of became the kind of dominant approach to dealing with the virus. But, one of the, and we certainly had, we do a lot of scenario planning at the Center for Risk Analysis. So we look at future trends and we look at key driving forces in society. And remember, these systems are highly complex. So anybody who says to you, well, they're a forecaster and they're going to tell you exactly what the future looks like, we usually say, well, you must be a bit skeptical of that person. You should be skeptical of us as well. But scenario planning is very different to forecasting. So scenario planning takes into account a variety of different kinds of futures and tries to identify what are the most impactful drivers or trends and what are the most uncertain trends. So what we did in our scenario planning is we said, well, look, one of the most impactful trends that's going to shape the outcome of the future is going to be the government response. And one of the most uncertain variables is going to be the case fatality rate of the virus. Because if the virus is as deadly as they said it was going to be back in February, March, then you could have quite a catastrophic outcome. But early on we did say, well, look, there's this emerging thinking, critical opinion that's starting to say, well, maybe the case fatality rate will be a lot lower. And so what we did is we plotted those two variables on an axis, and we came up with 4 distinct scenarios. And those were, I won't repeat them to you now, but those enabled us to go through with our clients in their strategy sessions and their board meetings and help them to say, well, look, we're not sure which way this is going to go. We have our own intuitions and feelings, but basically this matrix, this kind of dashboard, if you will help you to make the right decisions and to prepare for each of the distinct scenarios. So we do a lot of these briefs to clients, like you mentioned in your introduction, Big Daddy. We're currently running a free trial. So if you want to join us for 30 days, get a sense of the kind of the analysis, the research reports that we write, and also some of the scenario planning methodology, then you can definitely just follow the link in the description below, and we'll be happy to share some of that stuff with you.
Absolutely.
But I think that point, that very impactful influence of government, I think is really important. And yeah, I mean, I do want to kind of talk a little bit about the economics of what's going on in South Africa at the moment, Big Daddy. So unless you have any questions on those points that I've just made, I'll maybe just kind of paint the kind of broader macroeconomic picture.
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah, and I think it'll help you to understand and your viewers to understand, why the government is acting in the way that it is. So I think very important to know is that even before South Africa entered the COVID-19 crisis and the government imposed the lockdown on South Africa, the country was already in a fiscal crisis. So when we talk about fiscal policy, we're talking about basically government finances. And this has been brought about because of years of the government spending beyond its means. So when the finance minister spoke in February, he actually painted a pretty dire picture of where South Africa was. And so that was even before this massive volatility that kind of swept through the world and swept through South Africa. So South Africa now, if you fast forward to June of this year, when the finance minister then had to give his emergency budget, I mean, the numbers are really quite staggering. So government is looking to spend in 2020 1.8 trillion rand.
Sure.
So it's 1,800 billion rand, okay? But it is only due to generate revenue from taxation and other sources of about 1 trillion rand, 1.1 trillion rand. Yeah. Usually, by the way, the National Treasury is a bit over-optimistic about how much they're going to collect. And now bear in mind, all of this restrictions on business activity is going to suppress revenues for those companies and for the taxman. So, like the sin taxes from alcohol and cigarettes, that all of that money is going to be lost. And we saw the tax commissioner, saying there's about 12 billion rand, which has been lost there. So there's this huge gap between government expenditure and revenues of about 700 billion rand, which is about 15% of the debt, 15% ratio to GDP. GDP is the kind of the aggregate of all the wealth that is produced in the country. And that is the highest deficit that there has been basically since the First World War. So in over 100 years, we've never had a larger deficit.
That's crazy, David.
And so that means, I mean, I think it's, it's not just people who are policy wonks who should be kind of concerned with this. I mean, the government finances are just like a household. If you are spending money on your credit card every month and you're earning less than you're spending, sooner or later you're going to get into quite a lot of trouble. So, and South Africa is now reaching this point of a fiscal cliff, where basically in order to finance this deficit, this growing gap between expenditure and revenues, it's having to borrow more. And the debt to GDP ratio, which is the proportion of debt to the overall production of wealth in the country, that is creeping up to 80% or over 80%. When the finance minister spoke in February, he was looking at about between like 61 and 62%. So just in a few months, that's gone up hugely.
That's crazy. David, I wanted to interject because I'm seeing some questions even come through to this effect. We're talking about a lot of debt here, David, and someone has to pay this back. Just two questions from you guys. What are your views on, number one, the sources of this income and who will pay this? Do you guys foresee that it'll be levied from, the taxpayer, which I suppose, I think the short answer is yes, but I want to get your view on that. Or do you guys foresee a case where there'll be more government spending? That's the first side of the question. Then there's a question from JW, almost that rides onto this, with our economic policy paralysis, is any recovery, realistic? That's a question from JW.
Okay, well, let me address the first question. So on the source of funding, well, look, the government is borrowing. So it borrows mostly in what's termed rand-denominated debt. So that's kind of locally sourced debt. But it's also gotten a lot of money from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, recently, about 72 billion rand, which is a lot. And that's part of the emergency relief funding for COVID that the IMF has has granted us. So there's quite a low conditionality loan. So there aren't that many kind of restrictions on that. But there is quite a bit of accountability. You have to show that you're spending the money properly, that you're not going to be using it for corrupt ends or vanity projects or anything like that. But I mean, remember, that's only about 10% of the deficit. So that's not nearly enough. And we are now starting to borrow in foreign currencies. So that IMF loan was US dollar denominated. And the problem is that as that amount of foreign currency debt starts to grow, that becomes a risk. If your currency depreciates rapidly, you could have what's called a balance of payments crisis. We have quite a lot of foreign reserves in South Africa. The South African Reserve Bank holds quite a high volume of foreign reserves. So that balance of payments crisis is not there yet. But if we don't address our overspending, we're going to start to hit. Look, the government is desperate for cash. They need money from whatever sources they can. The finance minister said, well, he's going to introduce some new taxes in the next budget in 2021 of about 40 billion rand. I mean, that's a tiny amount. So you can't really tax your way out of this, because if you start increasing the tax burden, you're going to have particularly high net worth, wealthy individuals fleeing the country, restructuring their assets. A lot of very smart tax lawyers and accountants who can, come up with some very creative ways of minimizing your tax exposure. And so in economics, there's this term called the Laffer curve, which says that if you start taxing beyond a certain point, you actually have diminishing returns, diminishing revenues. So South Africa is well past that Laffer curve point. So you can't tax, okay? The other option is austerity. So that's vastly cutting back on state spending. But the government hasn't really shown a willingness to do that. The public service wage bill, which is basically civil servants, that comprises about 60% of all government spending. And there's a kind of political compact at the moment where, well, Mr. Ramaphosa and other elements within the ANC, they're really relying on the trade unions. And the trade unions are comprised mostly of public servants now. As mining and manufacturing has started to decline, and those unions, those industrialized unions have also declined in terms of their membership, and like NUMSA has split off from COSATU. That means that essentially COSATU is made up of government bureaucrats now, nurses, teachers, other local municipal officials, etc. So they're going to be very reluctant to stop that spending and to turn off the taps, right? And they're going to withdraw their political support if Ramaphosa tries to limit spending. So that's just going to keep ballooning. And, it's difficult. You've got to cut spending, and that a lot of government programs start to collapse, etc. Our recommendation would be just get the economy growing. And there was a second question there about recovery. And, it's a pretty dire picture at the moment. But if you look at South Africa, we have a lot of things going for us. We have very, innovative population, a lot of a diversified economy, fairly decent infrastructure. Okay, it's under a bit of strain at the moment. But the upside, the potential is huge. But there's this big wall, this big barrier of government policy, which is restricting business activity. So, I think South Africans are extraordinarily hardworking and capable, and it's not necessarily always a measure of your education. It's also about your, appetite to work and so on. So if we can remove some of those barriers, I think there's huge potential in South Africa, but it's conditional. We need to really look closely at some of these like holy cows that we have in terms of government policy, and start to say, well, hey, is our labor regulation working? Why are we having this discussion around property rights, with expropriation without compensation? That's a huge risk to foreign investment, which is the lifeblood of economic growth.
Well, David,
NHI, nationalizing healthcare. All of these things are big risks.
Well, I was about to say on that particular point, in fact, it's come up in the questions. I'm seeing sort of three distinct questions in that regard, and I want you to speak to them. Guys, just a very quick reminder, I'm in conversation with David Ansara from the Center for Risk Analysis, and we're just chopping it up now about some of these impediments that you face in terms of government decisions that stand in your way as a small, maybe micro, medium enterprise owner, and even large business, to be brutally honest. But there's a little question I'm going to ask David when it comes to large business, because there's a little bit of a forked tongue situation when it comes to them, but I'll get to that in a moment. David, the questions here really are beginning to sort of unpack some of these talking points that you've been raising. Shingwedzi is saying, should we look to maybe stop, I'm adding the question element because he just says, stop minimum wage and stop grants. That's Shingwedzi. Maybe we can just jot that down. We can come back to that. Because I think it just speaks to, on the one hand, prohibitive legislation for an entrepreneur. On the other, state spending, which is maybe becoming a bit of a burden. Wendy D says, what about the pensions grab? She's, of course, referring to the proposed policy, which is seemingly kind of here in a way, of prescribed assets by the state. David Hogg is basically talking about the issue, do you foresee tax evasion perhaps becoming an issue? And also asking, should tax evasion be a means of civil disobedience? That's a question from David Hogg. Dawn Ferreira is asking quite a specific question. I don't know if you can answer it, but she's asking, what have they actually done with all that money from the IMF? That's a question from Dawn. And then I'm just going to put two more questions to you, David, just to form part of the conversation. All right, there's people arguing amongst themselves in the comment section, so let me see if there's any. Two more questions here. JW Menkis, once again. JW, thank you so much for being on the show. What's the CRA time frame for something like prescribed assets? So that's maybe a nice direct way into that. And finally, David, just for this round of questions, Lonwabo Mahulo. The media is going to force us to unnecessary spending by ads. Okay, I didn't quite make that question. Lonwabo, maybe just retype that question and just type it out so I can read it. Maybe another one then. Barbara Sattler, Mr. Ansara's opinion on BEE regulations? Over to you, David.
All right. Okay, great. Well, thanks, Big Daddy. And wow, I'm very impressed by the questions, certainly keeping me on my toes. Okay, so there was a question about from Shingwedzi about minimum wage and the social grants. Look, I think it's important to understand that in South Africa, unemployment is really our biggest problem. So we have about 23 million people who are what you term economically active. So that excludes children and retirees and very old people, etc. And only about 17 million of them have a job. But we have, so it's probably a little bit more now, about 7 million people who don't have a job. So that economically active population has grown a bit. It's probably about 24 million now. And, so that's an official unemployment rate of about 30%. But the expanded definition, which is a different measure, which includes also people who've actively, they've given up looking for work. That's even higher. That's at around 38%. Which
is a tragedy.
So that's millions of people. Yeah, that's millions and millions of people who are essentially existing at the margins of our society. They're either dependent on the state for welfare grants or on their families, or they're just doing odd jobs here and there and not really earning much. So we need to take a really hard look at our labor regulatory framework. And there are a number of pieces of legislation, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, which act as a barrier to people entering and becoming active participants in the job market. And, as I mentioned earlier, a job is not just a source of income for you. It's also tied up to your identity as a person, to your sense of dignity. And, for that many, to have 7 million people in the conservative definition without a job is really a tragedy. And bear in mind that if you're a young person in South Africa, that rate is even higher. So that's over 50%. So you're more likely as a young person in South Africa to be unemployed than to be in a job. And that's really such a critical stage in your career. You need to acquire the skills that will help you to climb the ladder in terms of the job market. And our education system has let people down terribly in that sense. But, there are many other countries around the world which also don't have great education outcomes. I mean, if you think of a country like Ethiopia, for example, have a lot of unskilled people, but they've been able to mobilize this workforce of theirs, earning fairly modest salaries, nothing great, working in manufacturing, making shoes or wherever. But they're in a job, they've got an income source, they've got a chance. And in South Africa, many millions of people have just basically given up. And so all of these laws that are quite supposedly well-intentioned to protect workers and to provide decent work, this idea of decent work kind of flows through a lot of these rules. It's actually very indecent because it effectively prices poor people out of the job market entirely. So you become uncompetitive as a poor person. So if you're a poor person, you have no skills really, you have no capital, you don't have networks, so you don't have social capital, but you do have a willingness to work, okay? But what these laws do is they take away that willingness to work and say, sorry, you're not allowed to work because we don't think that this prospective employer is going to pay you enough, not a dignified wage. So that's the National Minimum Wage Act. And basically that national minimum wage prices you out. If you're willing to work for less than 3,400 Rand a month or 20 Rand an hour, then you're effectively going to have to break the law in order to do that, and many people do. So our recommendation would be to liberalize the labor market more, make it easier to hire employees if you're an employer, and also to fire delinquent employees. Often I think many employers, particularly of small businesses, are quite reluctant to take on new staff because it's a bit of a liability. You don't know what you're going to get. There's a bit of a risk, and a lot of talk is made, like rhetoric, about supporting SMMEs and that they're drivers of job creation, but actually not. So SMEs comprise the vast majority of businesses in South Africa, about 98%, but they only employ about 28% of the workforce.
Sure.
So, most of the work is coming from big companies, actually, and we need to change that. We need to flip that around, make it easier for small mom and pop kind of shops to hire somebody who's willing to work, maybe at a low wage in the beginning, but there's that potential to grow, learn new skills, and to develop. Mm-hmm. Shingwatsi was also saying, remove the minimum wage, which is a good thing, but also remove the grants. I think you should be careful about that. I think, just given how the amount of time that it would take for people to get into the labor market, there are a lot of vulnerable people in South Africa that depend on that minimum wage, on that social grant. Mm-hmm. And the social grants do go directly to poor people, and they do make a choice about how to use that funding. So if I were to pick between those two, I would say keep the grants, make the labor market more competitive, and then people won't need grants as much. I think most people would rather have their own source of income than be reliant on the state. So I think that problem would kind of solve itself. But my answer's been quite long, and I know there are quite a few questions in the chat. So maybe I should go through some of them a bit more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was also saying, I'm just keeping an eye on time also. We do have about just over 11 minutes. So if we can just get into those other questions.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so prescribed assets. I think it was Wendy who had that question. Yep. I think that prescribed assets is a real risk. And we had Enoch Onongwana, the ANC policy head. There was an article in Biz News today think it was BizNews, saying that, well, look, we're not going to prescribe assets, but we are going to change Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, and we're going to encourage pension funds to invest in state infrastructure projects and SOEs and other capital investment projects. And I think that's an alarm bell for many people.
Absolutely.
And they're back from business associations and the public in general. But, and there is a policy proposal that was put on the table by the ANC at the 2017 Nasrec conference. So this is a serious proposal that has been made by the party or factions within the party. And Godongwana is saying, well, look, we'll provide clarity in September. And, you saying, look, we're not going to force investments into particular assets, but, we're going to, if there's no market desire to invest, then we'll kind of encourage and prod along. I would say, no, that's a very bad idea. That's going to open the door down the road for longer term abuses and much more pressure. Bear in mind the ANC operates on a strategy and tactics methodology of basically the balance of forces. So when it gets pushed back, it makes a strategic retreat, and then will quietly in the background, reassert its interest in its position. So keep an eye on that this pension funds debate. I think that is a slippery slope, and as I mentioned earlier, governments run out of money, so they're going to be looking to tap into private sources of capital. There are about 18 million pension accounts and in South Africa, about 4.4 trillion rands worth of pensions. That's the largest pool of private capital on the African continent. It's one of the largest in the world, and the ANC is going to be keen to leverage that. So I would speak to your financial advisor, to your asset managers, and say, hey, we need some clarity on this, and we need you to take this seriously in your engagement with government. All right. Well, what else? So the time frame for prescribed assets, that's going to be September is when you should take a look out for these new proposed changes to Regulation 28, which basically makes determinations around how pension funds invest and allocate their capital. So keep an eye on that. Then there was a question on tax. I think from David Hogg. Look, I think there is going to be a lot of tax evasion, and the higher that tax burden goes, I think that's definitely going to be a risk for the government in terms of its revenue sources. I think there's potentially a crisis of legitimacy that the government might face. That people just say, well, hey, I need to pay my workers at the end of the month rather than paying tax. And anecdotally, I've heard a lot of this. We did some research last year in September, and a lot of the SMEs that we were looking at were, they were saying, oh, hey, we basically keeping our money in a shoebox. It's all very informal kind of stuff, paying our workers in cash. So I think there's a lot of unofficial tax dodging that's going on. And especially if people see that, well, governments, not necessarily managing this its tax revenue correctly. So I think that is a trend that I think is going to accelerate over the next short to medium term. Right, Big Daddy, I don't know, do you have any other follow-up questions? Are there any other questions in the chat or anything that I missed in my answers?
I'm just keeping an eye on time, and there's about 3 questions I want to get into because I think they also speak to some of the points you've made. What's the most, this is Rian Krokamp, or Krokamp, what is the most economical method to reduce the government wage bill? That's Rian Krokamp. What is the most economical method to reduce the government wage bill? I'm seeing Domenicos, lots of comments from him. Thanks, Domenicos, for that. There's a comment he made here, rather get rid of government's dead wood and use this money for grants. That's Domenicos. But actually, in the limited time, David, there's a key thing I wanna get your view on, and I think Kerry van Schalkwyk spoke to it. Kerry basically just said in an earlier comment, that she's written to her pension fund manager to say, hey man, what's your guys' view, and what are you doing to push back against prescribed assets? And really, the question I want to use Kerry's point on to pose to you is, David, it seems as though a big business generally over this period have been playing and dancing to government's fiddle generally, even when their own interests have been severely compromised. For instance, the big alcohol players in this country didn't really say a word of criticism to the state. They sort of played this weird, oh, woe is us game. And you could go across the line in various sectors that did this. Your views on this, David? Why is big business playing to the state's fiddle, so to speak, or dancing to it at least?
Well, look, Big Daddy, this is not a new phenomenon. If you look at the history of South Africa, big business never met a government it didn't like. And its attitude has always been go along to get along. And, even when, as you say, it's not necessarily within their interests, but sometimes it is within their interests. So sometimes big business will collude with government in a way that creates a lot of very restrictive regulation that big business can often afford to comply with by hiring compliance officers, etc., whereas small businesses can't. So when you think of business in South Africa, it's not, the interests are not necessarily uniform. They're not always the same thing, and often big businesses are colluding with government to lock out competition. So if you think of the data must fall debate a couple of years ago, people complaining about cell phone and data fees. Why is that? Is that because those companies were just being greedy and exploitative, or is it because that it's difficult because of the government licensing regime for new players to come in and to compete, right, to drive prices down? And so kind of fast forward to today, and I think there were a lot of quite well-meaning people within business who said, well, like, we need to support the government and we need to get private sources of funding available. And so the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts and so on put forward many billions of rands. There was the Solidarity Fund. But big business has often been really a bit reluctant to kind of question some of the ideological underpinnings of government policy, and to say, well, actually, this is not really working. And I think also, it is a bit naive actually when you say, okay, well, we will concede ground here and there, and hope in the long term that we can cultivate a relationship where we can have influence in the boardroom or in kind of private discussions. And in a lot of my conversations with a lot of businesses, they often say, well, we've had regular meetings with the minister, and we've had a cup of tea with the minister, and he's totally on board. And then you open the newspaper the next day, and there's some kind of crazy regulation that's been put forward and proposed by the government. And the same businessman that you spoke to yesterday is completely flabbergasted that this policy has been introduced. So we've seen it in the mining sector. We've seen it in manufacturing as well, now with the EWC debate in agriculture. So I don't think that this strategy has worked very well for big business. And often it's enabled government to push forward with very hostile policies.
Absolutely. And it's maybe as a concluding point, because we have run out of time, but David, I think you raised an important point, brother, because some people are really upset, especially the smokers and the drinkers, for instance, got very upset when, none of these big firms who they as patrons, they support, right? They support almost religiously to an extent. Suddenly when the chips are down and their own freedoms as a customer are being infringed, that very same big business just, let them go. David, I'm obviously going to have you back on the show. I think you are someone who we should look to having a regular feature that just unpacks, our very specific issues that I'll put to you on shows. And I really appreciate your time. Maybe as a final, just to give you the final word, really. I'm a small business owner. I'm really worried. Before this conversation, I didn't fully understand, the potential impact of a politician's decisions on my business. What do I do? How can I join you guys? How can I get more of your analysis on these issues and more?
Well, Big Daddy, I think the best way to engage with us is to follow that link in the description of the video to the CRA website. So it's cra-sa.com/free and then -trial, so free trial. That's our 30-day free trial. And what we do there is we produce a lot of reports, not very long reports. We have like a Monday morning risk note, which is about 2 pages, and it comes with a voice note. And we also have a lot of clients who engage directly with our clients, either with their management team or in a kind of a broader group. So we don't do, we do have our YouTube channel where we have short videos, short insights, but we don't do live feeds, unfortunately. We reserve those discussions for our clients. But basically what we try to advise is, well, don't be committed to kind of one view of the future. And we saw this a lot in early 2018 when there was the Ramaphoria. And people were convinced that Ramaphosa was this big reformer who was going to institute these changes, and there was a lot of bullishness. But at the time we were saying, well, things could go either way, look at various factors, within the party, within government, etc. And things materialized very differently. So if you were appropriately hedged at that point, so if you had alternative views in mind and you were able to spot the flags in the road, then you would have been able to adjust your strategy accordingly. So that's the kind of strategic advice that we give to our clients. And I would say that in times of crisis, you need to not just have your head down, your nose to the grindstone. You also need to have your eyes to the hills to see what's coming, because sometimes there's something on the horizon that's going to be a material threat to your business and to your interests, and you need to take the appropriate steps to protect your business, your family, and your assets to mitigate against those risks. And we'll help you to do that.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, that is David Ansara, who heads up the Center for Risk Analysis. I have put in the descriptor a link to their website. And really, please, guys, subscribe. Be in the know, especially if you're a business owner or just an individual, really, in the country. Guys, they have some great rates on there, which I really encourage you to do. David, thank you very much. And yeah, man, hopefully we'll see you soon on the show again. There you go, my brother. That's right.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thanks, David. Thank you, dear viewer, for being a part of the show. It's excuse me. It's guys like David, really, who add that great bit of extra depth in the analysis. And again, he's someone who I think I might even have, once a month on the show, him and maybe other experts, to really unpack some of these issues and give greater insight. So I really appreciate his time for having joined me. And thank you, as I said, to you, dear viewer. Guys, remember, you'll see me again on Friday for the podcast, which is syndicated on radio stations across the country. Hopefully we'll add to that list of radio stations that have syndicated the show. Catch me on Chai FM at 9 in the morning. I'm going to have John Endres on the show. Very interesting conversation with him, almost along the lines of what you heard tonight. But in this particular case, he's released a report around what would be the best, most effective way to get South Africa back on its feet and really on a 7% economic growth trajectory. So he's someone who I really think you should tune in on Friday and hear that out. That show will be podcast and available on all your favorite podcast channels, so you can look out for that. And of course, this Sunday, Late Nights with BDL. That's become the show that really does cap off a news week. I'm going to keep my guest secret for now, but someone who I think you will enjoy hearing on the show. Guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I am still on the ground. I'm in Cape Town doing work in our rural township areas, suburbia, speaking to people around how do we build this liberty-leaning society, a free, prosperous, non-racial, and property-earning society, the ideas that gets us to that. And I'm going to start bringing you a lot of that content on the show, so please look out for that too. And with that being said, thank you very much for watching, and remember, as I always say at the end of the show, never trust a commie.